Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence, by Ronald F. Levant and Shayna Pryor. Narrated by Charles Constant. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables presented in the print and ebook formats of this book. 1. Masculinity and the Present Cultural Moment. The time has come in our culture for a serious examination of the role of masculinity in sexual and gun violence, topics which have assumed a very high profile in U.S. society of late. Masculinity is a complicated and problematic phenomenon. We will also look at the role of masculinity in other contemporary social problems, such as the economic stagnation of white working-class men. In addition, there are long-standing issues of men's greater mortality than women and their unremitting suffering from mental illness and trauma, due both to their reluctance to seek help and other people's use of a masculinist perspective to presume that men do not hurt. Because masculinity is a cultural idea and there are many different subcultures in the United States, we will discuss different versions of masculinity, or as they are often referred to, masculinities, and how they have been studied based on cultural dimensions such as race, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, gender identity, and age/developmental stage. In summary, we will identify a relatively unacknowledged factor, masculinity, that influences certain high-profile contemporary social problems, analyze the nature of its influence, discuss the evidence that supports the role of masculinity in these problems, and, most important, address solutions. What is masculinity? The term masculinity is understood in somewhat different ways by different cultural and demographic groups in our society, as we have just noted, but there are two major conceptual orientations to the use of this term. It is important to discuss these orientations at the outset and define the way we will use the term. Masculinity is synonymous with being male. Most scientists recognize that human behavior results from an intricate interaction between nature and nurture. But most will also acknowledge that we are a long way away from knowing exactly how that works out in any specific instance. Some people ignore this dual causation and believe that nature is the only important determinant. Such folks tend to think that masculinity is synonymous with being biologically male. Examples abound, but here is one from a recent article in Psychology Today, in which Saad stated, "Women are attracted to toxic masculine male phenotypes that correlate with testosterone." Hence, in criticizing masculinity, listeners who view masculinity as synonymous with being biologically male may misunderstand our intentions and think that we are denouncing men. We are not. In fact, we feel quite a bit of empathy and compassion for boys and men in general, and in particular, for those boys and men whom we believe are imprisoned by masculinity. We use this prison metaphor throughout the book because, as we will explain in more detail in the following discussion, masculinity is understood to be obligatory by most men at some point in their lives, usually when they are children. For me, R.L., my empathy and compassion stems in part from the fact that I was in that situation myself and had to struggle mightily to get out. Not only was I brought up in a working-class home and neighborhood where I conformed to traditional masculine norms, which took me many years and a 4-year course of psychoanalysis to work my way out of, but also from the vantage point of over 4 decades of research, teaching, and clinical practice in the psychology of men and masculinities, I understand the powerful grip that masculinity has on many boys and men, and I will convey that understanding in this book. I've done research on boys and men's adherence to masculine norms, and on the socialization of boys to harden their hearts and restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. As a licensed psychologist, I focused my practice on traditional men. I have counseled many men seeking to overcome the effects of their socialization and open up their hearts to their families and regain their freedom, and I have taught many generations of students in these topics. As a woman, I, SP, have seen the dark side of masculinity. As a sexual assault survivor, a daughter, a sister, and a psychologist in training, I have experienced how masculinity can negatively impact not only men themselves but also the people around them. I specialize in investigating and treating men who have experienced intrapersonal trauma. I have seen how masculine norms can impede the healing process that men go through when dealing with past experiences of trauma. Another view of masculinity. There is another, more psychological view of masculinity, which is the one we use in this book. As Bohan noted, psychology distinguishes biological sex, being male, female, or intersex, from socio-psychological gender, referring to masculinity, femininity, as well as various non-binary identities. In this vein, we define masculinity as a set of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and behaviors that are generally considered to be appropriate for boys and men. Importantly, it also includes those that are considered inappropriate for boys and men, against which it has drawn a bright line. It is often considered to be a set of beliefs that individuals hold, which are based in socio-cultural ideologies regarding gender. Masculinity is therefore a social construction distinct from male biological sex. Definitions of masculinity vary across different cultures and historical periods. Both males and females can perform masculinity and femininity. In Chapter 2 of this volume, we go into considerable detail on contemporary masculinity ideologies and norms, and we will define what we consider the dominant form today, traditional masculinity ideology. Throughout the book, whenever we use the term masculinity, we are referring to this dominant form. In this view, masculinity is not hardwired due to genes and hormones, and therefore it is not essential nor inescapable for boys and men. Hence, boys and men can retain their gender identities without conforming their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors to masculine norms. This is the view we take in this book. We do so for several reasons. First, we are psychologists, not biologists, nor medical physicians, and psychology is what we know. Second, psychological phenomena, thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors, are more amenable to change than genes and hormones, and change is our ultimate goal. We wish to free men from the prison of masculinity to both improve lives and benefit society. Will a critique of masculinity threaten some men? Another consideration is that a serious critique of masculinity may be unsettling or even threatening for some men. In fact, a recent article was titled, "The Terrifying Potential for Masculinity. The Erosion of Traditional Gender Roles Destroys Much-Needed Security. What will replace it?" Scher noted, "The erosion of traditional manliness is the flip side of female emancipation. Underlying all brands of feminism is the assumption that sex differences don't imply gender differences. While biological discrepancies are inevitable, the manifold social consequences affiliated with them are not. They are socially constructed and thus subject to change. The liberating potential of this insight for girls and women has always been obvious, even to women who reject it. Men, however, are left with fear and lack of direction. Masculine ideals become debatable. Identities crumble. Certainties vanish. Restrictive as they are, the rules of masculinity provide clear goals and standards of right and wrong. Now they have disappeared, or at least their absolute validity has. What is left is confusion and a terrifying wealth of possibilities. Here is another example written in the first person. I read an article stating a university wouldn't stand for toxic masculinity, and then went on to describe male behavior in bars, being aggressive, touching women without their permission, and asshole nonsense like that. I agreed with every statement in that particular article. Then I read an article that asked, why do we even put the word toxic before masculinity? Isn't masculinity alone toxic? It made me roll my eyes so hard they hurt. Finally, a recent example shows how criticism of masculinity can be highly disturbing to some people. The Boys and Men Guidelines group of the American Psychological Association recently released a newly approved set of guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. The release was followed a few months later by a magazine article in the APA Monitor on Psychology and a tweet about the Monitor article and the guidelines. The tweet used the unfortunate term traditional masculinity, whereas the term used in the guidelines is actually the rather academic-sounding traditional masculinity ideology, and it came with a precise definition. In the Twitter era, everything gets stripped of context. As a result, negative comments flooded in on Twitter, as well as from conservative news outlets. Fortin reported on writers who subscribe to the view that masculinity is hardwired due to biological factors. If men are struggling more the farther we move from those traditional norms, is the answer to continue denying and suppressing a boy's essential nature? David French, a senior writer for National Review, wrote in an article about the guidelines on Monday. Traditional masculinity seems to be, in this report at least, conflated with being a pig or a creep or a Harvey Weinstein kind of person, said Laura Ingraham on her Fox News show on Tuesday. In addition, some of us who were cited in the Monitor article received hateful emails and threatening cell phone calls. Here's an email I, RL, received. Bro, are you a filthy Uden and a faggot, or just a filthy Uden? You look to me like you are a Kevin Spacey pedophile type, but I guess according to the Jew-infested APA, just like faggotry, pedophilia is a normal condition unlike toxic masculinity. You filthy cocksuckers, inverting right to being wrong and disgusting to being right. I hope Trump declare martial law sooner rather than later, call the white men only to the National Guard, and ask us to start rounding up little whiny faggots like yourself in 4 a.m. in windowless vans. We do understand that our thesis may be unsettling to some listeners, even deeply so, as the previously quoted email suggests. Such listeners may wonder what is left after masculinity is critiqued and problematized. We agree that alternative ways to be a man are not very visible at all. This is why our final chapter is devoted to solutions, in which we discuss sources that promote healthy ways to be a boy or man. So, long story short, we are not condemning men. We are simply stating that a socialized gender role with associated norms, namely masculinity, is an important contributing factor in several serious contemporary social problems. We spend the next 3 chapters focused squarely on masculinity. We discuss the psychological construct of masculinity in detail in Chapter 2, including the larger theoretical framework in which it is embedded, how masculinity is conceptualized and measured in the scientific study of men and masculinities, and what seems to account for its destructive effects. We will also take up the controversial topic of toxic masculinity. This will be followed by Chapter 3, which details the theorized consequences of socializing boys and requiring men to conform to traditional masculine norms, and then Chapter 4, which summarizes the research on the outcomes of endorsing or conforming to traditional norms, and of experiencing gender role conflict or stress. What is the present moment? There is an ancient Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. The present cultural moment that we are living in is certainly interesting, at times much too much so, and indeed curse-worthy. It is the result of the public's varying and often polarized reactions to the exposure of numerous high-power men as sexual predators and abusers, as well as to unremitting gun violence, particularly mass shootings, many of which have occurred at schools. In addition, the economic stagnation of working-class men is also playing a role in today's turbulence. Together, these phenomena have created a new iteration of the masculinity crisis first identified in the 1980s. According to Ruiz, masculinity is having a moment. There's a movement for a more expressive, more inclusive definition of manhood. Sexual violence. The cultural moment that we are responding to has arrived courtesy of the Me Too movement, in which waves of women from various industries and sectors of society have summoned the courage to publicly confront their powerful harassers and abusers. This movement was founded in 2006 by Tarana Burke, an African-American woman who began using the phrase Me Too to raise awareness of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in society. The phrase developed into a broader movement following the 2017 use of Me Too as a hashtag for the exposés of Hollywood, the infamous casting couch, and Harvey Weinstein, and continued on from there. It spawned the Time's Up movement against sexual harassment, which was founded by Hollywood celebrities in response to the Weinstein effect and Me Too. It has resulted in the conviction of Bill Cosby and the accusation of then Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. By October 2018, Me Too had brought down 201 powerful men, and nearly half of their replacements were women. The Chicago Tribune published a timeline of the Me Too movement from 2006 to 2019, which may be of interest to listeners. One critique of the media response to the Me Too movement is that it has focused on celebrity white women and ignored the complaints of black and other low-wage women workers. For example, Jones commented, "Though the Me Too hashtag was created by a black woman more than a decade ago, the faces of the cause have often been white and affluent, and the industries receiving the most media scrutiny have been the rarefied worlds of Hollywood and TV journalism. And yet it is black women in particular, and female employees of restaurants, factories, and other blue-collar workplaces who bear the brunt of sexual harassment and abuse." However, some of this may be changing as a result of Lifetime's 6-part documentary, Surviving R. Kelly. According to Tillett and Tillett, for 20 years, black girls and women accused the R&B singer Robert Kelly of sexually assaulting minors, yet he still enjoyed enormous success. They further state, "The backlash against R. Kelly includes high-profile celebrities and everyday fans, as well as prosecutors in Atlanta and Chicago who are looking into the allegations and asking potential victims and witnesses to come forward. And it builds on the Mute R. Kelly campaign, the cancellation of his concert last spring in Chicago, his hometown, and a statement by the women of color of Time's Up demanding that companies like RCA Records, Spotify, and Apple Music stop doing business with him." The pushback has succeeded. On February 22, 2019, after weeks of renewed scrutiny, Kelly was indicted in Chicago, accused of aggravated criminal sexual abuse involving 10 counts over 4 victims, 3 of whom were underage at the time of the alleged abuse. Furthermore, it is noteworthy that low-wage restaurant workers and women of color are leading the charge. Court noted, "Last Tuesday, September 18, 2018, McDonald's workers in 10 U.S. cities walked off the job to protest against pervasive sexual harassment. A week earlier, female janitors in California marched 100 miles from San Francisco to the state capitol in Sacramento to support anti-harassment legislation. The Janitors Union, SEIU, in partnership with the East LA Women's Center, has been quietly training women in self-defense and promoting peer-to-peer anti-harassment workshops and an assault crisis hotline." These legitimate criticisms notwithstanding, the Me Too movement has accomplished what heretofore seemed improbable, namely that the women's accusations of events that took place 10, 15, or even as long as 36 years ago were believed by a large segment of the population. Invoking a feminist slogan from the 1960s, the personal had in fact become political. As an indication of these changes wrought by Me Too, Southall reported that rape reports in New York City are up sharply, and Mayor de Blasio suggested that it might be due to Me Too. Reported rapes in New York City have risen for 16 consecutive months since last fall, when allegations of sexual misconduct against the movie producer Harvey Weinstein ignited a global reckoning about sexual harassment and assault, especially in the workplace. Mayor Bill de Blasio said the numbers appear to reflect a cultural shift in attitudes about sex crimes. "I think the Me Too movement is a part of it. Victims, survivors, know that they should come forward, that it's important, that they'll be protected, they'll be supported." This movement is clearly aimed at abusive men as well as the systems of enablement in the workplace and society at large. On this point, a Washington Post Schar School poll found sharp partisan divisions on views about accusations of sexual assault in the wake of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh's aggressive, grievance-driven performance before a Senate committee seems to have turned the tide for the Republicans against a credible woman accuser. Overall, 57% of battleground district voters say they are concerned that men they are close to might be unfairly accused of sexual assault, reflecting a conservative point of view. However, a far larger number, 78%, say they are concerned that women in this country are not believed when they report that they were sexually assaulted. Overall, by 59% to 41%, Americans say the bigger problem is that women who report that they were sexually assaulted are not believed. As we as a society move forward in this conversation about what constitutes consent for sexual activity, it is important to highlight the ambiguities that occur. One example is the case of Aziz Ansari, a popular comedian and actor who was accused of sexual misconduct by a woman pseudonymously named Grace in an article on the website Babe. He was shocked by the account, having felt that encounter was consensual. He not only issued a letter of apology, but also addressed the situation in a pop-up comedy show. According to an article in Vox, he admitted that the allegation against him was a terrifying thing to talk about. However, he said, "It made me think about a lot, and I hope I've become a better person. Another example is the case of former Senator Al Franken, which Mayer recently reconsidered. She argued that Franken's Senate Democratic colleagues judged him too quickly and harshly. We will explore in detail masculinity's role in sexual violence in Chapter 6. Guns and other physical violence. The category of gun and other physical violence addressed in this book includes school and other mass shootings, the killing of unarmed black men by white police officers, hate crimes like the attacks on black churches, Jewish synagogues, and LGBTQ persons, and domestic/intimate partner violence. We will discuss this in detail in Chapter 5, but we will comment here on the way that school and other mass shootings have contributed to the present moment and also discuss some broader issues. Adding to the present moment, but coming from a different direction, is the movement March for Our Lives, started by the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School students, such as Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg, and Delaney Tarr, in Parkland, Florida, who survived the February 14, 2018 mass shooting there. Although the shooter was male, as are most mass shooters, from 1982 to 2017, only 3 American mass shooters have been women, whereas 93 have been men. This particular movement rarely comments on the gender of the shooter and has only recently mentioned masculinity as a factor, but rather has focused on gun control or mental illness. Most physical violence is committed by males, but are all males violent? Consider the fact that most of these criminal acts of physical violence are committed by boys and men. In fact, 87% of violent crime in the United States is committed by males, and most of that by white men. That does not mean that most males are violent. Although the jury is still out on what causes violence, some think that the propensity to act violently is due to the red triad of personality traits, which includes A, amorality, B, being thin-skinned and not taking criticism well, and C, being hot-headed and quick to get angry and aggressive. If true, and as we discuss shortly there is reason to doubt that it is, personality traits such as these would likely not be normally distributed throughout the population, but rather highly skewed to the lower, non-violent part of the distribution. Those who actually behave violently are in fact a tiny minority, whose scores on such tests would be in the extreme high end of the distribution. Personality traits or the social situation. Furthermore, social psychologists have shown that personality traits are poor predictors of people's actual behavior, which would be even more true with very low-frequency behaviors such as violence. In fact, based on numerous studies over many decades of the relationships between various personality traits and their corresponding behaviors, Ross and Nesbitt have estimated that, at most, personality traits account for 9% of the variation in their corresponding behaviors. That is, scores on a measure of a personality trait, say independence, will only weakly explain whether participants will behave independently in any given situation. Much more of the variation in behavior is accounted for by the power of the social situation. It should be noted, though, that psychological research typically accounts for less than 50% of the variance in the variables of interest. In the present case concerning male violence, the social situation in question would be the socio-cultural ideologies about masculinity, which create compelling expectations for how boys and men should think, act, and feel. The role of biology. As we have previously touched on, some might argue that men's greater perpetration of violent acts is due to innate biological factors that make men more violent than women, and they might invoke the controversial role of testosterone. It is controversial for several reasons. First, people of all genders have both testosterone and estrogen circulating in their bloodstreams. Second, as MacArthur Grant recipient Robert Sapolsky has noted, there is no dose-response effect. That is, in studies of non-human primates, the animals show the same level of aggression whether the level of testosterone is manipulated from 20% to 200%, although aggression does decrease when testosterone is reduced to 0. Sapolsky theorized that testosterone has a permissive effect, meaning that some testosterone is required for aggression to occur, but it in no way completely explains aggression. Third, in studies of testosterone's effects, correlation, the association of a biological factor with a behavior, is often mistaken as evidence of causation. Sapolsky's work on testosterone further suggests that it might not always cause increases in aggression, but that aggression may result in increased levels of testosterone. For example, a well-known correlation is that testosterone is higher in juvenile delinquent boys as compared to normal boys. Did testosterone cause the delinquency, or was it the other way around? Delinquency elevates testosterone. We really cannot say based on present evidence. However, even if it were to be proven that males did have a greater biological propensity for violence, we also know from studies of both human and non-human animals that any propensity for violence can be modified and even subdued by social and psychological factors. For example, Old World monkeys use violence to establish a dominance hierarchy. But with these monkeys, there is less violence when there is a dominant male. In contrast to the biological perspective, we will show that physical and sexual violence is influenced by the outmoded yet still influential definition of masculinity, although, as will be shown in chapters 5 and 6, the theorized pathways of masculinity's influence are somewhat different for these two categories of violence. Masculinity and the economic stagnation of white working-class men. The present masculinity crisis concerns not only sexual and physical violence, but also the economic stagnation of white working-class men resulting from the confluence of large-scale economic, political, and social changes. These changes include the Great Recession, dubbed at one time the man-cession because of its disproportionate effect on men, technological and productivity advances, globalization of the economy and the rise of China and India, weakening of labor unions and the resulting loss of high-paying union jobs, and growing income disparity. Earlier stages of these changes were described by Hannah Rosen in her provocatively titled book, The End of Man and the Rise of Woman, and even earlier by Susan Faludi in Stiffed, The Betrayal of the American Man. 2 articles on this topic appeared more recently in The Economist. According to Men Adrift, jobs that used to take 100 men now take 10. A strong set of hands is no longer enough. Furthermore, blue-collar jobs now take more skill than they used to. In addition, the problem is not just due to changes in the labor market. It is also due to the poor performance of boys in school compared to girls. Geerdartis put it this way: globalization, the internet, automation, mass migration, the emergence of India and China, the financial crisis of 2008, the rise of women and their displacing of men in more service-oriented economies, the civil rights movement and the emancipation of other groups and the loss of status for white people, these are just some of what we have lived through of late. Yes, the world has gotten better for hundreds of millions, but Fukuyama reminds us that across much of the West, people have suffered dislocation and elites have captured the fruits. Economists Otter, Dorn, and Hansen argued that adverse trade shocks, like a surge of imports from China, differentially reduce employment and earnings of young adult males and heighten male idleness and premature mortality. These changes have resulted in unemployment or underemployment of white working-class men. According to the weaker sex, in America, pay for men with only a high school certificate fell by 21% in real terms between 1979 and 2013. For women with similar qualifications, it rose by 3%. Around a fifth of working-age American men with only a high school diploma have no job. This has resulted in a huge sense of grievance, which plays a prominent role in our country's current political turbulence. Claire McCaskill, the former Democratic senator from Missouri who was recently defeated in her re-election campaign, was interviewed on the podcast The Daily. She had an interesting insight into why so many white working-class and rural people have abandoned the Democratic Party. According to her, these people see the Democrats helping women, gay men and lesbians, blacks and immigrants from Mexico and Central America, and ask, "What about me?" The sense of grievance may also be related to the increases in opioid addiction, overdoses, and suicide. Although a recent study argued that the supply of these drugs is a more significant cause than despair itself, just on the face of it, one would think that despair is probably a factor, although evidence supporting this has yet to emerge. On this point, a recent study linked chronic opioid use with a preference for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election, and Trump's campaign most assuredly fanned the flames of working-class resentment. The role of masculinity. Working-class men have been found to endorse traditional masculinity ideology more strongly than men in higher social classes. Adherence to masculinity exacerbates these men's difficult situations in 2 major ways. The first is the role it plays in their unwillingness to consider jobs in fast-growing service fields that are thought of as feminine, the so-called pink-collar jobs, such as in health care, child care, elder care, education, bookkeeping, sales, and food preparation, endeavors some of which are performed as the unpaid work of housewives. Rosen noted that of the 30 occupations expected to grow fastest in America in the coming years,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?